Welcome to another episode of Your Hope-Filled Perspective. I'm your host, Dr. Michelle Bengtson. Every week, it is our hope to restore your hope, renew minds, and empower listeners to live in their God-given identity. Martin Luther said, if you want to change the world, pick up a pen. And today, we're going to be talking about writing to reach the world. 2 Corinthians 3, verse 3 says, you show that you are a letter from Christ, the result of our ministry, written not with ink, but with the Spirit of the living God, not on tablets of stone, but on tablets of human hearts. Today, we're going to be talking to my friend and fellow encourager, Linda Gilden. Linda's an experienced writer, speaker, editor, writing coach, and personality consultant. Author of the popular Love Note series, she's also the author of several dozen books, including Mommy Pick-Me-Ups, Mama Was the Queen of Christmas, Personality Perspectives, Called to Speak, and articles. With over 1,000 magazine articles to her credit, she's a prolific writer who loves to share a great story. She speaks nationally throughout the year, is a frequent radio and television guest, and welcomes the opportunity to help others become better communicators. Her favorite activity is floating in a lake or pool, reading a book, surrounded by splashing grandchildren. A great source of her writing material. Welcome to the program, Linda.
Thank you so much. It's great to be here. It's a beautiful day, isn't it?
It is. And it's always a great day when we get to share our story. Will you tell me a little bit about you and your history and how writing became a passion for you?
I have kind of a roundabout story. It's not the normal, if there is a normal writing story, but I really wanted to be a writer. From the time my second grade teacher let me read my story in front of the room, I wanted to be a writer. And I followed that path until my senior year in college. And I was taking a creative writing class. And I fully expected this paper to be returned, A+, send it to the publishers, all of that on it. And it didn't. It had C+ on it. You have nice handwriting. Now, handwriting back then was more important than it was now. And we had to write the story by hand. But that is not what I wanted to hear. And although those are nice words, those words aren't bad words, but they did not encourage me. And that particular instant made me realize the power of words, because those few words changed the course of my life for about 15 years. I never wrote again.
Wow.
And then as I had children and I was working at a church, and I began to be writing things like press releases for the church, brochures, and I just started doing that sort of thing. And my husband was like, you're really writing. And I'm like, oh, no, I'm not. You know what Miss Griffin said back in college? He said, forget her. I think you need to try this. And so I thought, well, I don't know how to start. And I went to the library, and, most of those books seemed like they were copyright 1928. And I asked people around, but it was like it was just the best guarded secret in the world. Nobody wanted to tell you how to do it. And then my neighbor across the street walked across one day. We did a lot of walking together. And she said, my dad is sending me to a writer's conference, and he thinks you should be my roommate. And I was like, I have no idea what a writer's conference is. She said, I don't either. Let's just go and see what it's about. And so we did that. We went to the first writer's conference. That was in 1990. That was quite a while ago. And just felt like we had landed in writer's paradise. And the other side of my coin to that was, whereas Mrs. Griffin had really discouraged me, I met an editor there who, at that time you could send critiques and the editors would read them. It was part of your tuition. They don't do that much anymore. You pay extra for them. But I saw Charlie Warren come into supper, and he was editor of Home Life at the time. And I knew I had given one of my manuscripts to him. And I just froze. I'm like, I knew he had seen me. And so I couldn't really just run. I couldn't hide, but I just was so afraid of what he might say to me. And my story was about my son skipping stones on the lake. And as I walked up to Charlie and we said our little pleasantries, He said, "Oh, I used to skip stones when I was a little boy." And that particular experience, those few words made me realize, aha, you have got to connect with the heart of your editor before you can connect with the heart of your reader. It's all about the heart. It's all about relationships. It's all about that connection. So that's kind of how I got started. He bought that article and I began writing more for him. And um, it was just a snowball from then on. You just couldn't stop me. I mean, my children were small, so I was writing during nap time, which often was 10 minutes. But I was writing in my head all the time. And then when the children were in taking their naps or at night, I just, as fast as I could, I would get it all out on paper and just stop when I had to stop and get started over again. So it was just kind of an interesting journey in that a lot of my experiences bordered on just a very few words. But that experience with that one editor not only gave me the heart connection, it made me realize that editors are people just like you and I. I'm pretty shy. So I don't just walk up to people and strike up a conversation easily. And editors, especially, people would put him on such pedestals. You don't talk to him, he's too stern, or you got to talk to her, she's really sweet. And talking to him made me realize that editors are just like you and me. They just happen to be editors, and I happen to be a writer. And we're working together. We're all on the same team to get this message out that God has given us. And if we each do our jobs well, then we will reach the world. So that experience was just gold for me when I did that. And that was the first of many conferences. And as the journey went on, I started directing conferences, and I started writing more. And I didn't really want to write books. I love articles. Articles are fun. And so I really didn't want to write books. And it was just like one morning I woke up and God said, "It's time to write a book." And I'm like, "But I said I didn't want to write a book." And he said, "It's time to write a book, and this is what it's about." And so he just kind of laid it all out to me. And the first book happened, and so I've written several others since then. I still write articles pretty regularly because I do love articles.
Linda, share with us just a little bit, if you will, about you and your history. You and I have been friends for a long time. I met you at class services.
That was a long time ago.
I don't even know how many years, over a decade ago. But for my listeners, tell us a little bit about your history and how writing became a passion for you.
I always thought writing was fun just because it gave me a way to get the stories out of my head. I was kind of a dreamer in a way, and I just like to make up stories. And so when my second grade teacher let me read a story in front of the class about my baby brother that had just been born, that got me hooked. I was done. I'm going to be a writer from now on. This is the best thing there could be. And so that's the way my journey kind of took me. I made great grades in English. Give me a number and it's just awful. So the words began to how much I loved words, just grew and grew and grew. And until I was in college. And then my senior creative writing teacher gave me a paperback not a paperback book, but a paperback that I had turned into her. And I fully expected that paper to be just glowing with her accolades and just encouragement. And, this is the best thing a senior in college has ever written. Send it on to the publisher now. You're going to go places, all of those things. And what was written on there was C+, you have nice handwriting. Well, that's only 4 words, but those 4 words just cut me to the core. And because I really thought I was doing pretty well. And she didn't say my writing was bad, but she said what sounded to me rather than, "You do have nice handwriting." Well, I did have nice handwriting. I didn't want to hear that. And where she was trying to compliment me, my melancholy personality at that time just read that as give it all up. And so I did, and didn't do much writing for 15 years. And in between there, I did different things. I had 3 fun, beautiful children who appear often in my writing, but I didn't write a whole lot. And so when I began working at my church, I was the children's director, but then they discovered I could write and edit and do this kind of stuff. So I was doing some press releases and brochures and publicity materials for them. And my husband said, "Why don't you try this again? You really like doing this." And I'm like, "I know, but don't you remember?" And he's like, "Forget the class in college." And so I went to him and I said, "Okay, I think I'm going to try this, but I don't know how." All the materials, it's better now than it used to be, but in the library, if you went to get a book, most of them were written copyright 1928, I think was the one I remember the most. That's a long time ago, and publishers normally change things between then and now.
Just a little
So,
bit.
yeah, and I would see people in the grocery store, and I would say, I really want to start writing. How do I do this? Because I knew they did it, and it was like they had been sworn to secrecy and signed the paper that said they would never tell anybody to do it. That this was just not something you spread around. And as a side note, I think that's why God gave me such a heart for helping other writers, because it was so hard to find out how to do this myself. And about that time, my neighbor walked across the street, and she said, "My dad is sending me to a writers conference." And I was like, "Okay, what's a writers conference?" She says, "I don't know, but he thinks you should go and be my roommate." And I was like, "Well, I don't know a thing about this." She said, "I don't either. Let's just go figure it out." And so we did go to that conference, and it was wonderful. I mean, my kids, when I came home, they're like, "You can go to any conference you want to. You act like you've just been to paradise and back." And I was like, I don't know why they picked the word paradise, but they called conferences Writer's Paradise from then on. But that conference changed my life back in the other direction. Whereas those four words about my handwriting took me into a real tailspin and a nosedive, I was at this conference, and Charlie Warren, who was editor of Home Life, he no longer is, but he was at the time, he came walking up to me because he'd edited one of my stories. And as he walked up, I was just, my insides are just churning. I mean, I'm just so shy. I don't do well with candid conversations. If I know what we're going to talk about, I'm good. But just to walk up and do small talk, that coupled with my personality, which thinks that you don't want to waste time, that's just such a, small talk is just, why small talk? So, but he walked over there, and my story was about my son skipping stones, and I had made an analogy with that and life. And the first thing he said, he just kind of put his hand on his chest and he said, "Oh, I used to skip stones when I was a little boy." And to me, that was like another few words that turned me totally around, because it said to me, number one, I have a heart, and you need to reach that heart. Your editors are people just like you. You to reach them with your message, because if you can't reach the editor's heart, and I might add the committee's heart and everybody else who it has to go through, then you're not going anywhere with that. So that was a big statement to me, that I need to reach the editor's heart first. Also, that editors were very personable. They're people just like you and me. He just happened to be the editor, I just happened to be the writer, and we're on this team together. Our goal is to get the message of Christ to the whole world. And so I was going to do my part and write, and he was going to do his and get it out there. So I did begin writing for him. He bought the article. I mean, that was so exciting. I think they paid 0.03 cents at a time, a word or something like that. Um, but it was just another big lesson for me. It seems like a lot of my writing lessons came in a few words, but that was another thing that just kind of gave me that little push I needed to turn around and say, well, maybe I do have something to say that's worth something. And just in watching during those 15 years of not writing, watching my children and how God manifested himself to me through them. Yeah, I had a lot I wanted to write about. So
You,
that's kind of those things, how they went.
you and I have very parallel stories that way. Because I had graduate school professors who, they think that their role is to break you down before they build you back up.
Right.
And I had the graduate school professors who told me I couldn't speak or couldn't write. And it was at a writers' conference where editors showed interest in my writing. And I thought, wait a minute, you mean I can write?
Yeah.
But what both of our stories show is that words have the power to bring life or death, blessing or cursing, and our words do too.
That's
Ju-
right.
Just like you and I were both given words that were basically death to a writing career, and then given words that would revive life, the words that we share can do that for others. I've always known that I was called to write, but some may be listening and might not be sure. How do you know if God's calling you to be a writer?
That's such a hard question to answer for anybody other than yourself. However, I think there's a fine line between being called and just the desire to write. I think sometimes people see the things that I've done, the things that you've done, the books on the shelf, things that other people they have done, and they're like, oh, I really want to do that. But that doesn't necessarily mean that they're called to do it. When God calls you to do something, you just can't not do it. And I know that's a double negative, but it's important to you to say it that way. You just can't not do it. And it's like when I walk by my computer, it just beckons me to sit down, even if I just get another sentence or another paragraph on the paper. I just can't not do that. So I think that's one of the differences for me anyway. I think for each of us, it's probably different the way that God called you. But I knew definitely at that point when I was at that first conference that yes, I somehow I had gotten off track and it was time to get back on.
I have many writer and author friends, as you do too. But one thing that makes you different from many of them is your study of the personalities, which I'm interested in as a neuropsychologist. But I'm curious, why is the study of personalities important to your career as a writer?
Many writers don't really think that they think that's kind of like superfluous material that they don't really need and that they're giving readers stuff they don't want. But when you use the personalities and you make sure your characters or the words that you print in nonfiction are within a personality, then your reader can identify with them. What you want your reader to do with your writing is to say, oh, I felt like that. Or, oh, that could be me. And when they see a character solve a problem or turn back to God or whatever it is that they're doing, they're identifying with the personality. And that is what, to me, is so important because you can pretty much ruin a book if you have one character that goes along, it's a really strong character. Then all of a sudden in the middle of the book, you've gotten to love this character. You're cheering for him and all of that kind of stuff. Then in the middle of the book, he just melts. And all of a sudden he becomes a wimp. And you can have a blend of personalities, but it's not that it's not that different from one to the other. So I think that's why that interests me so much, because I really do enjoy seeing the characters develop and being writing and thinking, oh, she would never do that, or he would never do that. Or sometimes the characters just take your writing away from you. I used to write a lot of drama when I was working in the church, and I can remember one day sitting there and just laughing out loud. And my children were probably junior high school at the time, and they're like, "Mom, what is so funny?" And I was like, "You won't believe what he just said." And they're like, "What are you talking about? You wrote that." I know, but they just run away with it sometimes. And so you want to know what their personality is so you know how they can run. And you want to know how for instance, if you've got a very melancholy or organizer, there are lots of words to use for these different personalities. But you've got one that's really strongly that way, he or she is not going to go find a crowd of people to console them when something goes wrong. They're going to go back to their room all by themselves and just give themselves time to process it. And if they start acting, exactly, me too. So if they start acting out of that and do the wrong thing that is not consistent with their personality, they become unbelievable to your readers. So I think, to me, that's one of the big things, that it's just so important that we know that. But it's also important because we've got readers of at least 4 different personalities, if not more.
Mm-hmm.
And I need to know that I'm going to have some mobilizer or choleric, whatever you want to call them, whatever label you do, um, readers, and they do not want fluff. They want me to lay it out, give them a bullet point or a checklist, if I will, And they want all that information, but whereas some of your readers who love setting and description and all that will enjoy all that, they're good. The choleric or mobilizer ones are just going to fill that out and take that out of your reading and kind of put it in their own form. Same way with the socializer, they want the fun stories. Your stabilizer is going to just enjoy going for the ride, which is your phlegmatic personality. Your organizer or your melancholy is going to get into the deep emotion of it, and they're probably going to want to know more about the character than you have room to tell them. But all those things enter into who your readers are. And so if you can provide your readers with something that draws them in, you're also going to increase your readership and sales of your books in that way.
So good. Friends, we're going to take a real quick 1-minute commercial break, but when we return, we're going to hear Linda share more about the different personalities and why we need to know about them. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Your Hope-Filled Perspective. Linda, I want you to talk just a little bit about the different personality styles. When I first met you at class eons ago, I think they had different labels than they do now. But the reason I write and the reason I'm on social media are the same: to uplift and inspire and encourage. And it's important to me, in order to be able to do that, that I know these different personalities. Can you just give us a brief kind of explanation of what they are?
Sure. For me, the personalities kind of snuck up on me. And by that, I mean that when I first went to class, which was even before we met, I went because I had my first book out. I was just too shy to get up in front of people. I didn't want to speak. I didn't want to talk. I was happy being in the back of the room and just holding my book, hoping somebody might like to see it and read it. But when I went to class the very first time, there was about a 15-minute, maybe 20-minute segment on the personalities. And at first, when they started talking about it, I was like, what in the world are they going to talk about personalities for? I mean, I want to know how to speak. Just tell me how to speak and I'll be happy and I'll go home. And so they began to talk about the personalities, and I saw myself, I saw my family, I saw my children. I learned that I was so much of a perfectionist. I was imposing that on other people, especially in my family, and making them miserable. And so to me, it was just eye-opening. It was enlightening. And so I realized how valuable that information was, not only in relationships, but also in everything you did. At that time, they used the words choleric, sanguine, melancholy, and phlegmatic. To
Yep.
me, those words were a little I had to practice how to say them for a while because they just didn't roll off your tongue.
Right. Right.
So Hippocrates, I think, is the one that came up with some of those, and he probably didn't have any trouble with it. But for me, it was a little bit of a little bit of work to try to get them to come off my tongue
Well,
like I want.
and none of those labels sound very nice. So I didn't like
Yeah.
any of those labels. I didn't want to be any of them.
Yes. So Linda Goldfarb and I, several years ago, decided we were going to try to write a more reader-friendly personality book. And we came up with the Linked Personality Series. And we made them in the form of quick guides because most people don't have a lot of time. And if you can just give them some clues about some of these personalities, it will help them. So we used labels that were different because of the reader-friendly thing, we didn't want the reader to have to sit there and go, color something, or phlegmatic, what in the world, could that be? So we called your choleric personality the mobilizer, because that's what your choleric personality does. Your choleric personality is, let's get it done, I can fix it, let's make a checklist and we'll just check it all off. And then they're happy. And then they'll move on to the next job. We also, the socializer is what we called the stabilizer, is the phlegmatic, which is kind of your laid back, just somebody who is kind of happy-go-lucky, doesn't like conflict, likes things to be calm, peacemakers. Really, the conflict is the major thing with your phlegmatic stabilizers, because
my sister was very much that way. And, she would do anything to keep things calm at our house between my brother and myself and her. It didn't matter if she was right or wrong. She was going to keep quiet. They never get excited. I can remember one time we were swimming in a lake and she looked at me and she said, Linda, you may want to move Christy over about 3 feet. And I'm thinking, okay, this is my 3-year-old. She said, there's a snake right behind her. And I'm like, what? Yeah, I mean, that would be cause for excitement, in my opinion. Come on, if you're ever going to get excited, it
Yeah,
would be when there's a snake by your 3-year-old
absolutely.
child in the water. So I'm very used to that type of personality because of that. Your socializers, just like they sound, they are the social, um, just the life of the party. They love to tell stories. Often they don't finish their stories though, because they think of a better one. They'll be telling a story and they'll be in the middle of it, and all of a sudden, bang, they thought of something that's even better. So they'll just kind of leave that
Yep.
first one in. And it's hard for some of the socializer people to actually stay on task. That is their biggest drawback, is that they have a hard time staying focused, especially for writers. They'll think of a better part of the story here, or somebody will call and ask them out to lunch, or something that will distract them. So a lot of times socializers will have to come up with ways that they can reward themselves if they get something done. I have a friend who's that way, and every morning if I go into her office, on her whiteboard, she has got written what she's got to get done and what is her reward at the bottom. So it may be a phone conversation, maybe lunch out, could be anything that she likes doing. So that's a way that she has learned to keep herself on task. And so I think that's good advice for anybody who is a socializer, because they just love people. And then you have your fourth one, which is your melancholy we call them the organizers in our linked system, but they're called melancholy when class was using that system. And melancholy people are very deep thinkers. As I mentioned before, they are perfectionists.
Mm-hmm.
If you can't do it right, just don't do it. Let me do it and we'll get it done.
That's it.
And that's just not right either. So I particularly with our children, as parents, I think this is so valuable. And we do have one of our books is linked for parents. In that series of the link, because unless you realize that you've got 4 children or 6 children or 8 children of different personalities, you probably treat them all the same. You don't realize, and when one is 2 and stacks her blocks by color in uniform rows, that's because it's her personality, or because one flings them across the room because it's just fun to see those bright colors go all. So if you can learn that as an early parent, then you can also learn that there are ways to increase their willingness to help, increase their relationship with their siblings and with you. So I think knowing the personalities is something that benefits. And of course, you've got the whole work side. We could talk for several days on this whole thing.
Mm-hmm.
But even at work, it works the same way. Delegate, but give them something that fits their personality style. So
So when I write, either in my books or on social media, it's always because I want to uplift and I want to inspire and I want to encourage others. So in the back of my mind, I always know my why. But I'm curious, from your perspective, what are some ways that writers can encourage hope in their readers?
one of the things I think that's really important is for us to be honest,
Mhm.
to be able to tell them when we aren't feeling productive, when we maybe aren't feeling well, and how do we, or we're discouraged, we're depressed. Let them know how we're feeling and how we solved that problem. What was it that got us through that? And hopefully it'll be a time where we can actually share God's message with them. But if they're not believers, you've got to bring them to that point where they're willing to listen to that as well. But I think the upbeat encouragement side of your words, and there's lots of ways to write anything we want to say. And so I think if we pay attention to what we're saying and we say it in a hopeful, encouraging way, then even if the reader is discouraged at the moment, perhaps that will plant a seed that will come back to them in another moment when they're sitting around just moping, feeling sorry for themselves, or just trying to pull themselves out of the dark hole. So I think that that is a great thing for you to keep in mind when you're writing. I think hope needs to probably be in every reader's mind that's a Christian writer, in every writer's mind, because if you are a Christian writer, that's what you want to leave with them.
Yeah.
You want to entertain them, but you also want to give them the hope that you have.
Well, you know, hope is my anthem, so I'm all about that. In addition to being a writer and a speaker, you are also a coach. Would you talk for a moment about how someone would know when a coach would be helpful and how they might go about finding one?
I would love to, because I think coaching is the most fun thing to do of almost anything, because you get to see people learn, you get to walk them through it. I was doing editing for a publisher years ago, and finally they came to me and they said, "You are doing too much coaching, you need to just be editing." And I said, "Well, what that amounts to is I was doing too much hand holding." And
Uh,
and rather than, normally when you employ an editor, for those who maybe aren't in the writer world, when you employ an editor, you want them to fix it. And when they give it back to you, it's done. If you were to hire a coach, the coach would walk you through your manuscript. And at the end, if you're paying good attention, you have learned a lot, and the next manuscript you write will be even better with your first draft. So to me, the process of seeing somebody learn and just have those aha moments is very gratifying, exciting, and just fun to be there when you see that light bulb come on. Or if I have a client and I meet with them, and when we get back to the second meeting, they're like, "Well, I looked at what you said about that last week, and I took everything you said and I went through the whole manuscript and fixed it." I mean, that is exciting to me when
yeah.
they're that serious about learning. And if you hire a coach for the first book or whatever, first article, first book, whatever you're writing, the next one you would not need somebody to walk you through as much. And the process would be a learning process. It's like a coach in anything. You know, you're learning football, you're learning soccer, you're learning whatever you're learning. As a coach develops a rapport with you and you develop that rapport back, then you begin to understand what they're trying to teach you. You begin to see what they're commenting on and how they're trying to help you get from point A to point B. And for both of you, it becomes a really good experience.
Friends, we're going to take a real short 1-minute commercial break, but stick with us because when we return, I'm going to have Linda share with you her hope-filled perspective. We'll be right back. Welcome back to your hope-filled perspective. Linda, I'm curious. So many people, I think, struggle with fear. And I'm wondering what you think some of the biggest fears are that writers have.
I think there's a very simple answer to that, and that is that they can't do it. They begin and they're like, "Well, I just don't know what I'm doing. I can't do this." Look at John Grisham or some of these big people that have been writing and have just lots of books out there. You can't start there. He didn't start there. He started with one book. Everybody starts with one, and it probably wasn't his first one he wrote. So I think the fear, though, for a writer is that, well, for me, it was getting over the relationship thing and having to talk to editors who I perceived as um, wrongly perceived as probably going to be critical and all that sort of thing. They weren't. Their editors are very encouraging to you, and often if you show a manuscript to an editor, they might say, "Well, I can't use this, but why don't you try this publisher or this publisher?" So they're all working together as well. But I think the greatest fear is just it's the unknown if you're new, because you don't really understand the business. And the other thing is just the fear that you're not going to be good enough. And that is not true at all. If God says to do this, he's going to make you good enough.
Yeah, that not good enough one, I
Yeah.
think, is one that resonates with a lot of people, whether they're writers or not. If a listener is struggling with their purpose or their call or wondering what direction to go in, what hope-filled perspective would you want to offer them?
It may sound a little simple, but just do something. When you are struggling with whether or not, let's say writing, since that's what we're talking about, writing is your call, but you're not really sure if it's your call or if you just want to write, take some courses. Do
Mhm.
they excite you or is it drudgery? Is it fun? Is it not fun? Take some courses, then start writing. Just write a manuscript or two. If you have an opportunity to show it to an editor, get their reaction. And when you come to a point that we spoke of a moment ago that you just can't not do it,
Yeah.
then you'll know it's your call. If you can take it or leave it, you may be very successful as a writer, but it's not your call. There's something else that is in there that is calling you in a stronger way than writing.
We started this episode off by talking about the fact that God gives each one of us at least one story that others will benefit from. And sometimes it will be through writing and sometimes it will be through other means. But if someone is listening and feeling that nudge that the Lord's saying it's time to tell your story, what's one thing that they could do today to start on that path?
I am a really big outline person. So I would say if you're going to write your story, make an outline and see how it all fits together. Can you fit it together in a way that would benefit someone else? Maybe not. Maybe your story is more than one book or more than one article, which often it is, and new writers want to put everything they know in the first book.
Yeah.
And that's hard to say, you've got to take this out or save this for something else. But I find that outlining really helps me to do that. My first book had a 35-page outline. Most people just think that's absurd. But yet when I got ready to write it, it was all in order. I just knew exactly what to put where and which story to went in what part. And I think as you begin to unfold your story into book form or outline form, I can't really put into words what the feeling would be, but it's like when you do something and you just know it's the right thing.
Mhm.
In the movie Chariots of Fire, Eric Liddell says, "When I run, I feel God's pleasure." If you're writing and you feel God's pleasure, write faster, run harder. If you don't feel that pleasure and you're struggling, keep exploring it if you want to do that, but don't let it drag you down. I mean, there must be something else that's pulling at your time and your desires if you aren't feeling that pleasure
Mm.
when you're writing.
I appreciate you coming on the program today and encouraging those who might be thinking, I think I'm supposed to write. I think God wants me to share my story and to keep in mind the different personalities. I want to close out this episode with a scripture, and that is Habakkuk 2:2 that says, "Write down the revelation and make it plain on tablets so that a herald may run with it." It's because those who went before us wrote things down that we've got testimonies of God's goodness and his faithfulness and his trustworthiness. And in sharing our own stories, others will see that as well. I hope this has encouraged you today to consider how you might share your story for others' good and for God's glory. As always, this has been your Hope-Filled Perspective with Dr. Michelle Bengtson. Until next week, make it a hope-filled week.